making a single page application. A single page application, which means it's just going to have one view. And you could do a single page application in handlebars, but we're not doing it in handlebars. We're doing it just in plain old HTML. There's no embedded code in here. There's no ERB. There's no HBS, nothing like that. The whole way we're interacting with the server on here is through Ajax, through JavaScript. And because of that, because there's not any, the server is not really doing anything fancy with the view in here, I'm just putting it in the public folder. If I wanted to do something with it on the server side, I would put it in the views folder, but here I'm really not doing anything with it except just making it show up. The same way with a style sheet or an image or whatever. So I put it in the public folder. But that said, so single page app. Let's see, what is this question? What makes something a single page app? How is a single page app different from any other sort of app? First, what's the super obvious answer for a single page app, Armand? Yeah, it's on a single page. Yeah, so that's the big difference. So what's the advantage of that? Like, why would you want to have something on a single page?
You don't have to worry about routing.
You do have to worry about routing because you want, like, you probably want different bits of information to show up based on what the user does. And you have to figure out some way to get those different bits of information to show up. So you still need routing. Yeah, Andrew?
Let's say as a user, you know that all the information you need to be on that page.
Well, you know, I would say users are probably pretty ignorant and don't necessarily even realize that it's a single page app. Like Trello, I think you guys have probably all used Trello. That's a single page app, but I've never really thought when I'm using it, this is a single page app before. It's just, now that I think about it, I'm like, oh, snap, what do you know? It's a single page app. So advantages of a single page app versus something else.
You don't have to download all the resources over again.
Yeah.
It's once that you just change this.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Imagine if with Trello, you had to do a page refresh every time you typed something into a card. If Trello wasn't a single page app, you would have to do that. Anytime you deleted something, anytime you created a card, anytime you edited something, you would have to refresh the page. And when you're doing like, well, for Tuner, it doesn't really matter a whole lot because Tuner is a tiny little app. But for something like Trello, where user experience is like 99% of the reason why people use that app, that is a really big deal. Having all those page refreshes, that would make for this horrible, disjointed experience, and it would take a really long time. Having everything just running through Ajax so that you don't need to refresh the page, that makes for a much, much better user experience. So when I say single page app, I don't mean a website that is just one page of HTML. For instance, my personal web page, that is a one page of HTML with some, like, a little bit of JavaScript and CSS in it, but there's no like manipulation of data going on in there. Would I consider that a single page app? No. Why not? What makes an app, aside from the fact that it's probably written on the board right here?
Just like some type of data manipulation, or like interaction between the user and the data.
Yeah, exactly. There's not like a hard definition for what makes an app. Well, maybe there is. I don't know. But my definition is an app is something that lets you interact with data somehow, beyond just reading it. A website is something where you just read data. An app is something where you interact with that data somehow. So a single page web page, I don't really care about that, whatever, that's just a simple web page. But a single page app, that's a really powerful thing that can be used, if done well, really very much to your advantage. And so that's what we're doing with Tuner in this class today. So yeah, full disclosure, this probably would be much simpler just doing what you did with all of your Rails apps, where with our Rails apps, instead of just having one view, you had a whole bunch of ERB files, and then those would all get put into that layout file and everything. You had a whole bunch of different ERB files. In fact, I would say for most of your Rails app, most of you probably didn't have any JavaScript at all in your Rails app. They were just multi-page apps. The reason we're making Tuner a single-page app, well, honestly, it's mostly just so you have practice making a single-page app. But also, there are a lot of apps for which manipulating all of those different pages can really make it much more complicated. In addition to the user experience being kind of it can also make it much more complicated for you to maintain. But mostly we just sort of want to practice with it in this class. Yeah, Davis?
Is Rails capable of a single-page application?
Sure. Yeah, and you would actually do it the exact same way in Rails as we're doing it in Express. So you would just have one view, you could put it in the public folder in Rails, and then you would just have a whole bunch of JavaScript on there. Justin?
Well, specifically Davis, you did something interesting in your product where you said like turbo links false. Right? You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah, I forgot that was an error because it was labeling it like a single page. Right? You needed that whole page. Or like turbo links. I don't know where I was going.
Okay. But yeah, you totally could make a single page Rails app. You can make a single page Sinatra app. Ain't no problem with that. There's one other thing that now that I'm looking at the notes I didn't mention, which is that doing a single page app makes your app really extensible. And when I say that, I mean it separates the concerns a whole bunch. So with this tuner app, it's actually basically two apps. You have the API, that's what Express is taking care of, and then you have the front end that's interacting with that API. That way there's sort of a single point of contact between what's going on in the browser and what's going on in the server. So that'll make more sense if I explain something that's not a single point of contact, which would be a Rails application with a whole bunch of different views. All of the stuff that governs what shows up in the views and all the stuff that governs like what happens to the data, that's all sort of mixed together. You have all this ERB stuff that's manipulating data, making it show up different ways. You have all that right in the view files. However, with this Express app, really the only thing that the Express part is doing is it's just serving up data. That's all it's doing. It's not formatting the data. It's not making the data show up in a certain way. It's just spitting out JSON. That's all it's doing is just spitting out JSON. Making stuff show up on the page and changing how the views should look, that's all done by the front-end JavaScript. So actually making the data show up, that's the responsibility of the Express app. Doing stuff with the data, that's the responsibility of the front-end JavaScript. The reason this is cool is because it means you could take the front end of your app, you could take the front-end JavaScript and host it on GH Pages or some server halfway around the world, doesn't matter. And you could have the backend on a completely different server. And so you're not sort of bound together. You totally can't host a Rails app on GH Pages. All it does is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. But you could host this front end on GH Pages because your front end is just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And then you would have all the Express stuff running somewhere else. So that's just, I think that's just sort of cool in and of itself, but I'm a nerd. The actual practical application of that is that you can have your users create their own interfaces to work with your data. So for instance, when I was working for Coinbase, I was helping manage their API. And so Coinbase was not a single page application. It was a Rails application, and they had lots of embedded Ruby and everything. And then they had their API. So they were managing two huge, completely separate apps. And my whole thing while I was there was like, hey, instead of having these two huge, completely separate apps, we should just merge them into one app. Like instead of Coinbase having its own sort of internal way of interacting with data, and then this API that it makes available for everyone else, it should just use its own API. And it should just make all the user information show up with its own API. That would simplify things so much. It would let users be able to basically make their own Coinbases, still using all of Coinbase's software and everything, so Coinbase wouldn't lose anything. In fact, they would gain probably a lot of customer loyalty because people would feel like they're contributing to this thing. And also a lot of customer feedback because developers are nerds and we really like to get super excited about working on stuff. Like this way, if someone sees a problem, they can just be like, sweet, I'll just make my own front end. And I'll address that problem, and then, hey, I'll share it with Coinbase. Maybe they'll want to use it. Maybe I'll get paid for it. That's kind of nice. So there are real tangible advantages to it. There are some things where you may not want that. I mean, Coinbase, their big thing was security, so that's ultimately why they didn't go for it. But depending on the app you're using, this can be a really good way to sort of endear yourself to your customers and get like really good customer loyalty going is by doing this whole single page thing if you make your app developer friendly. So, I've been standing on my soapbox for a bit. Questions about that? All this single pagey stuff.
Does the amount, we were curious, does the amount of data that you're going to be playing with factor into any of these decisions at all, or is that?
That's a
That's
good.
kind of how you handle that, you address that somewhere else.
Yeah.
Where you set up
That's a really good point. So if you have data coming from like 38 different sources all going into one view, then a single page app may not be a good idea because anytime someone loads your page, they're going to have to make 38 AJAX requests. And that's going to get pretty expensive pretty quickly. But if it's something where it's Tuner and all it's doing is just showing artists and songs, or it's Coinbase and it's just showing data about your Bitcoin account, then it might not be a bad idea to just do it all with AJAX. But here's the thing about everything that we're teaching in this class. So I'm skipping ahead in the lesson plan just a little bit. We are not teaching you the right way to make an Express class, to make an Express app in this class. We're not teaching you the right way. Why not? That's a trick question. Exactly. There's not a right way to make an Express app. So the whole file structure that you see in here, everything in here, this is stuff where, unlike in Rails, there's no one saying you have to have this folder, you have to have that folder, you have to have that folder. Everything you see in here, the way things are named, the way everything is laid out, that's just what the instructor who wrote this, that's just what made most sense to them and what they thought would make most sense to other people. I mean, what makes most sense to them, that's informed by like what the conventions usually are and like what they think other people are going to be looking for. But still, there's not like a right way to make an Express app. Going along with that, we're teaching object-oriented JavaScript and Express at the same time. You totally don't have to use object-oriented JavaScript with an Express app. You don't have to use JavaScript at all with an Express app. Express is like literally the exact same thing as Sinatra, except it happens to be written in JavaScript instead of Ruby. It's the exact same thing. And I don't think we incorporated any JavaScript into any of our Sinatra apps. The only reason we're using OJS and Express here is because they look pretty similar. There's a lot of stuff going on with callbacks in front-end object-oriented JavaScript and Express. And because we're sort of tackling the same beast in two different places, we figured we'd just sort of do it at the same time. But no, you don't have to use JavaScript at all with Express. You totally don't have to use object-oriented JavaScript. You could just have one, just a whole bunch of jQuery if you want. It doesn't have to be object-oriented and fancy and everything. But again, the reason we're doing it is because it sort of works nicely with some of the things that we're doing in Express. And also because object-oriented JavaScript is the basis for what we're going to go over next in this class, which is Angular and potentially Backbone as well. Pretty much every JavaScript framework is object-oriented. But it does a lot of the object-oriented stuff for you. So you don't really have to worry about prototypes and all that stuff as much. It does a lot of that for you. But it's still based on everything that we're doing in here with all this object-oriented stuff. Yeah?
Totally all or nothing, like you either have to do single page app, everything, like all HTML is built in JavaScript, or if like on Rails apps we have different views. If you have like different databases, you sort of somehow serve that server side and then still have like
Yeah, totally. So again, Trello. Trello, I sort of lied. Trello is not a single page app. Like your profile page, I'm pretty sure is a different page than the one that has all the cards on it. And also you can have different Trello boards, and each of those is a different page that has their own URL, has different sets of cards. But I would say each of those boards is sort of like its own single page app. So it's sort of like apps on top of apps. Yeah, you can mix all of this stuff together. I'm getting excited. I'm getting like Jesse goosebumps right now. You can mix all this stuff together. There's not really a right way to do it. What we're showing in this class is what we think is going to be the best structure going forward, and what makes the most sense to us as instructors. But you can pick and choose and mungle this stuff together really however you want. Other questions?
So it's a hard one,
Mhm.
think about good newspapers that have a lot of content, and it's very dynamic in terms of so that's kind of the situation we have that trouble.
Yeah, I don't even know what the right answer would be for that. I mean, different newspapers do it differently. Like New York Times, I'm pretty sure they have everything on a separate page, whereas USA Today, they do something I really don't like, where it's basically just one page, and they sort of make the article like appear in the foreground, which I think is weird, but whatever. They know more about user experience than I do. But yeah, there's no right answer. It's just doing whatever makes the most sense for you. So going along with this, I put together kind of a little list of why you might want to, well, indications that you might benefit from from making your stuff more object-oriented. You don't have to, but it might be a benefit to you when you look at your code and you see that it's more than 100 lines long. You spend more than 5 seconds looking for a piece of code, which goes right along with number 1. 3 or more function names share a word. So like this one, song create, song update, song destroy. A certain variable is used in less than 25% of the lines. So I'm sure that's happened with a lot of you where you create some variable, use it a couple lines, and then never use it again. When that happens, that's a pretty good indicator that that would be something that would fit nicely inside its own method, maybe inside its own object as well. And then you want to procrastinate working on something else, and you want to look fancy. So yeah, when I don't really know how to move forward with my app, I like to just go back and refactor and just put stuff in objects because it's what I do with my free time. But let's see, I'm gonna introduce this at the end of the class as well. But if you want an example of some code that would really benefit from being more object-oriented, here is some code that I wrote back when I was running noteboards way back in the day. So way back in the day in 2012. And this code was to change a PayPal button, like change the price of your shipping based on where you lived, and change how much each noteboard costs based on how many you ordered. This also, let's see, does something with making this header image I had fade in and fade out. And if you look in here, you can see there is not an object anywhere. And even though I'm scrolling through here like at light speed, all of these like 32 methods right here look almost exactly the same, like just staring at them as they go by, which is a pretty good indicator that I could probably have dried this up considerably. To my credit, it's all very well indented. But I have this 392 line file that just has a whole bunch of stuff all over the place in it. I'm doing document element get ID like 300 times in here. There are lots of things that I totally could have done better. It worked, but I remember that it was a pain to maintain. I would say if you ever find yourself dreading going back and working on your app simply because it takes so much energy to find where things are, that's a really good indication that it should be refactored somehow. But we can come back to that later on. All right, any questions about all that stuff?
So we're not making it object-oriented. Are we writing functional program? What are we doing when we're not making object-oriented?
I would say it would probably be lumped under functional programming. Yeah, I don't know. What would you say, Jesse?
I would call that procedural.
Oh, okay.
Anything where you're expecting lines to happen after one line. Functional is a little bit different.
I actually don't really know the difference. I know object-oriented programming, and I know not object-oriented programming. But more nuanced than that, I'm not really sure. Other questions? Mm-hmm. Nah, because I don't own the website anymore. But I mean, what I'm doing right now, so before class started, I mentioned this I need a prompt website, which just generates a random writing prompt every time you click on it. And right now, that is one enormous PHP function, like a 100 lines long PHP function, which is just like a 100 lines long JavaScript function. And this is, sadly enough, probably the most successful web page that I've made, just like on my own volition. And so right now I'm going back and I'm refactoring the code so that it's object-oriented, well, so that it's front-end JavaScript on Express, actually. So I'm making it exactly what we're doing with Tuner. expressy single page app. But yeah, the noteboard stuff, nah. That's, if I was gonna do it, I should have started it years ago. And now I just go back and look at it and just like, man, it's like cringing middle school memories. All right, so what all is going on into this single page app is we've got these 3 bits of JavaScript right here, the script.js. That's sort of like the, this is just going to be the JavaScript that runs to make everything else on the front end run. It's like app.js, except for the front end JavaScript instead of the back end JavaScript. And then we're also going to have models and views in here. The models are what lets you sort of interact with data, and the views are what makes that data show up. And we're going to go through basically what you did yesterday to get this app set up. Just want to point out these .getKeep files. They're just like the .keep files you may have seen in Rails where they literally don't do anything. It's just to make sure the folders show up on GitHub. Because if you have an empty folder, Git doesn't track it. So this way it makes sure that it shows up on GitHub. But you can delete these, rename these, do whatever you want to these. They're not doing anything. All right, so getting caught up from yesterday. So the way this is going to work is we're just going to sort of do this together. It's going to be a lot of copying and pasting again for this part, but I'm going to sort of try to explain what's going on at each step as we go. So let's start off with this. We've got these models and views folders. So let's go ahead and put some files in there. I use touch in here, but I'm just going to do it in Atom. So we're going to have a model for artists. And I'm just going to call it artist.js. You don't have to call it artist.js. You can call it wombat.js. The only reason you wouldn't want to is because it's going to get really confusing when you go back and look at your code. But the name of the file really doesn't make any difference here. So artist.js, song.js, and then same thing for the views. We're going to have artistview.js and songview.js. And to use them, we'll need to actually include them in this index.html. Right now it only has script.js, so I'm going to go ahead and include all of those in here. I don't think we've done anything crazy so far. We've just made some blank script files and included them in an index.html, the way you would any other script. But going forward, if something seems weird, please ask a question. Object-oriented JavaScript is probably the hardest thing we teach in this class, and so now more than ever, I guarantee that if you have a question about something, everyone else has, or well, lots of other people have the same question. And so it'll make you a good person if you take one for the team and man up or woman up and raise your hand and ask it. Oops. All right. So now I'm going to add this to the artist model. I'm going to ask that you, sorry, I should have said this before, please follow along in the lesson plan. I'm not going to bother slacking all this stuff out. Please just follow along in the lesson plan. So the artist model is going to look like this. All this is doing, well, actually, here, I phrase it better in the lesson plan. This doesn't seem very dry. What's the point of doing all this info stuff? And of course, it says the answer on the next line, but let's assume that it doesn't. Why are we doing all of this? It doesn't seem very dry at all. Tom, what do you think?
Well, let's see, that's something that's structure function, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, my first reactions, we need some sort of starting.
Yeah. Well, but why? So this var artist thing, like these lines have to be here. It's these lines that I'm curious about. Why are we doing it this way? So by comparison, we don't have to do all that. We could just do this.info equals info and not have all this stuff in here. And then if I wanted to get the artist's name, like if I have an artist, var artist equals new artist, I would do artist.info.name. Doing it the way we did it before with the commented out stuff, it would be artist.name. So, why are we doing it this way, the way that is now commented out? Why are we doing it this way? Really simple answer, not a complicated answer.
It's just something that's gonna come up over and over again, so you're saving yourself taking that extra info.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We're saving ourselves having to write 5 characters a whole bunch of times. This is really just doing the same thing. It's doing exactly the same thing. The only difference is just saving us from having to write 5 characters a whole bunch of time. I don't want to write .info a million times if I don't have to. But that's it. It's not doing anything fancy. So, should have that in your artist model. And then, so this looks terrible. We're going to go through it a little bit at a time. Well, I just put the answer up here. But artist.fetch. Where's it? Oh, I'm covering it up on my computer screen. That's not going to help at all. Where should it go, guys? The model file. Yeah. I'm going to put it in here because it's something that we want to do with artists. We want this to, yeah, Davis?
Right about here in Rails, when you do some kind of validation, like strong commands or something,
Yeah.
why don't we do that here?
Because it's not, I would say it's not really so important. The reason it's not so important is front-end validations don't really count for a whole lot. Because anyone can get by a front-end validation. A front-end validation, like, it really just changes whether or not, like, you can make an alert pop up if someone, like, doesn't write a correct email address or something. But if they know how to use Chrome's inspector, they can get right past that and just go right past all those validations. So front-end validations, they're completely just a user experience thing. There's no data integrity advantage to them. It's just a user experience thing. But yeah, if this was backend, then we would do it somewhere in here. So this .fetch method, what is this analogous to in Rails? Imagine this was an artist model in Rails. What would .fetch be like in there? Yeah, it's the exact same thing as .all. We're just calling it .fetch in here. I don't really know why we're calling it .fetch in here. I guess just because it, yeah, Jesse? I was just going to say just because it's fetching a whole bunch of stuff from the database. And we don't really want to get it mixed up with like the back-end language.
Yeah, well, that's what I was going to say, right? Also, they have I don't know what the word is, but that is coming, right? Like, as a replacement for asynchronous
Oh, I didn't know that. Huh.
I'll sign that.
Cool. Today I learned. Could someone, let's see, who'd like to volunteer to go through this from the top to the bottom and explain what's going on at each step? No one volunteers at this point. Yeah, Chase, what do you got?
So the first line in there is making an AJAX GET request to that URL.
Mm-hmm.
Get based on abbreviated way of writing out a full AJAX request. And then it takes the response and loops through it, adding or creating new instances of artists and adding it to this artist array.
Yeah, and I'm going to stop there because, thank you, that was perfect. But all this return stuff gets kind of confusing. And so I'm just going to leave this here for now. And that's something we can revisit later on. But this is one of those things where it's important, but it's also pretty tough to wrap your head around, I think. What's going on here is that we're not just returning the data, we're returning the request out of this function itself. So the request is like the state of communication between your browser and the server. It's not the data, it's the state of communication. The reason we're returning that is because we want to be able to do something like artist.fetch.then function something, something, something. That's the reason we do it this way. If we didn't, so when we're returning the request, but artist.fetch actually is the request. And so we're saying when the request completes, we want a whole bunch of stuff to happen. Davis?
Can
you throw up the artist controller real quick and walk me through
The artist controller?
what the JSON request is hitting?
Oh, yeah, it's hitting all this stuff. So don't worry too much about this. Basically what's going on is it's finding all the artists, it's adding songs into them, and then it's rendering a whole bunch of JSON. And that's it. So it's taking all these artists and it's rendering them as JSON. You can see exactly what's going on if you go to localhost 3000/artists. And there it is. That's what the backend is spitting out. So, and that's what your front end is getting, is all of this. So you can see the artist in here. I named the Yaya as Garth for some reason, but you can see all of their different songs in here. But I'm not going to go into that a whole. Well, yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Yeah, this exactly has to do with promises and deferred objects and everything. The reason we're returning, so this request right here is basically a promise. The reason we're returning that is because we want to be able to say, when the request completes, we want a whole bunch of stuff to happen. Exactly. That's exactly right. We're doing this to manage the asynchronous stuff, to prevent the later stuff in the script from happening before we've actually gotten the data. That's exactly right. Elise?
So it's hitting the first then on line 10.
Mm-hmm.
And then kind of jumping down when we do it from 24. It already hit the first then, and now it's hitting the second then.
Yep.
And so this is kind of like chain together with the then.
Yeah, you can chain together thens willy-nilly. No problem. The reason you do that is so you avoid callback hell, which I think is probably somewhat familiar to you guys. Remember this Ajax function? It's always, Juan and I were talking about this yesterday. It's always going to look something like this. So I'm just making up sort of a random API app. Without using .then, you would get something like this. So success, when it's successful, do this. You get the data from Google in here, and then let's say you want to do something with that data from Google. So you want to make a request to Google, and then you want to make some other API request based on that data you got from Google. So you go in here, you do Ajax. Let's say you get a movie result back from Google. Now you want to look up something on imdb.com. And you do success function, data from IMDb. Okay, now let's say you want to take that data and make an API request to Netflix. So you're going to do Ajax URL netflix.com success function. You see how I'm sort of gradually working my way more and more across the page? Yeah, and so if you keep on going like this, eventually you're going to be working in a space like this wide, right at the right-hand side of the page. The whole reason we use .then instead of all this stuff is because this looks really ugly and is really hard to maintain. But what you see right here is the exact same thing as Ajax, URL, whatever, .then, Ajax, return, Ajax, .then, function, I know I spelled that wrong, return, Ajax. It's the exact same thing. And then as long as you return that Ajax, you can just keep on going and keep on doing .thens. And then instead of going horizontally across the page, which gets pretty hairy pretty quickly, you're just going vertically, which is much easier to read. But it's not a performance thing, it's completely just a readability thing. When people talk about callback hell, they're talking about this. Does that make sense? It's not a performance thing, it's just a visual thing. Which is important when you're staring at this stuff all day. Yeah, Tim.
Can I ask why we're returning artists on line 15?
Why we are... Yeah, so if we didn't have this line, this return artists is what... I'm going to change that just a little bit. That return artists is what makes artists show up in here. If we didn't do return artists in here, then we wouldn't have a response to work with. So that's what makes it show up in there. It's what passes it to the fail function, and also in turn passes that out of here. Yeah, I know, weird, right? Basically, we have to return it in here in order to make it available outside here. Yeah.
Especially only when that one fails.
Well, it's what also makes it available outside here. But the thing about this stuff is, so this is kind of where I want to stop. And if you want to, like, I would say for now, just sort of get to know this pattern. And then when you're using this, there are going to be a lot of times when you forget to put something in here and it doesn't work. So I can come up here and talk about this till the cows come home, but I don't think it's really going to click until you actually are writing one of these for yourselves and like really have a need for it, because this stuff is really pretty weird. And it's important, but it's not something where I'm not confident in my abilities to articulate. So I encourage you to just like play with it, see what happens when you take out return artists, what you get. You're going to get some sort of thing probably saying response is undefined. And so then you're going to think, okay, why is response defined? It's totally right in here. What should I do? And then you can go on and sort of like keep playing around with that. Yeah, so another part of the conversation me and Tom and I had last night is like with this stuff, there's a whole lot of how to do something, but not a lot of why to do something. And so the analogy Mia came up with, not to put you on the spot, was it's sort of like you're cooking in someone else's kitchen. Where if you've ever done that before, it's like the weirdest feeling in the world because you don't know where anything is, you don't really know how things work, but you actually do. If you stop and you breathe for a second, you can probably figure out like how you're supposed to use the different implements. You're not really sure why they have like a vegetable peeler in the cutlery drawer or something, but they have some sort of a reason for it. And wherever it's located, it doesn't prevent you from using it. It's the same thing with a car. I have no idea why a car works, but I know how to use a car. And unfortunately, it's sort of the same thing with JavaScript. Understanding the why usually doesn't come until you've been doing it for a while. But the how usually comes first. Remember, the point of programming is to build stuff. If you really want to understand the why of everything, then you're probably going to need a computer science degree at some point. But how to do stuff, it's a lot of just sort of memorizing patterns. Let's take a break there and then come back in 10 minutes, so at 10:15.